From the earliest testimonies of Christianity, the figure of Mary of Magdala has occupied a relevant yet controversial place. Her closeness to Jesus of Nazareth and her participation in fundamental events were recognized in the oldest traditions. Over time, different interpretations modified her memory, shifting her active role toward more restricted images. The transformation of her representation altered not only the perception of her presence among the first disciples, but also her importance in the transmission of the teachings. This journey reveals the secrets that accompanied her name, the conflicts that conditioned her memory, the versions that limited her influence, and the recent efforts to restore her place in the origins of Christianity. What were the secrets that accompanied Mary of Magdala? Childhood and environment of Mary of Magdala. Mary of Magdala was born in an era characterized by the intense interaction of religious traditions, political tensions, and cultural transformations. Her place of origin, Magdala, situated on the shores of the Sea of Galilee, was a prosperous fishing center known for its production of salted fish, an activity that linked the locality with trade routes to regions like Damascus and Alexandria. Mary's family belonged to an economically comfortable sector of local society. Her father, Nathan, was an important merchant of fishing products, a position that granted him prestige within the community. Mary grew up in a large house built with solid materials and decorated with mosaics, a symbol of a relatively prosperous life by the standards of the region. From her earliest years, Mary showed a notable inclination towards knowledge and reflection. However, the social and religious norms of the time severely restricted educational opportunities for women. While her brothers, like Silvanus and Eli, received formal instruction in the Torah and the prophetic writings, Mary was instructed in domestic practices and the fundamentals of Jewish piety, in a family environment that valued tradition and the strict observance of the Mosaic law. Family life unfolded under a solid hierarchical structure. The father exercised undisputed authority, the male children were prepared to continue the family businesses, and the women were destined for supporting roles within the home. In this context, Mary's talent for introspection and her sharp spiritual perception went unnoticed or were minimized. The city of Magdala, although firmly rooted in Jewish traditions, was not exempt from Hellenistic cultural influences. Trade with non-Jewish regions introduced aspects of Greek thought and practices foreign to Mosaic orthodoxy into the locality. This forced coexistence of cultures generated visible tensions within families, including Mary's. While Eli defended religious purity and rigorous respect for ancestral customs, Silvanus sympathized with elements of Greek culture, an attitude that provoked constant discussions within the family. From an early age, Mary witnessed the latent conflicts between the need to preserve religious traditions and the attraction exerted by new cultural currents. This early experience of contrast between opposing worlds fueled her critical capacity and her willingness to question the realities imposed by her environment. One of the formative events in her life was the family pilgrimage to Jerusalem to celebrate the festival of Shavuot. The journey crossed hostile territories, such as Samaria, where religious and ethnic differences manifested in distrust and suspicion. The journey, fraught with tensions, exposed Mary to the diversity of the people of Israel, revealing to her the deep internal divisions affecting her nation. The arrival in Jerusalem and the majestic vision of the temple deeply impacted Mary. The solemnity of the rituals, the fervor of the pilgrims, and the grandeur of the ceremonies left an indelible mark on her memory. However, she also perceived the social inequalities and the rigidity of the religious structures, aspects that would sow questions in her that would later surface with greater force. Mary's childhood was not without experiences that challenged the orthodoxy of her upbringing. On one occasion, during one of the stages of the journey, she discovered a small pagan idol hidden among the stones. Although she knew the strict prohibitions against such objects, her natural curiosity led her to observe it closely, fascinated by its shape and beauty. The tension between her religious upbringing and her fascination with the unknown manifested clearly in this episode, foreshadowing the spiritual complexity that would characterize her adult life. Daily existence in Magdala was a mixture of strict religious observance and inevitable contact with other cultures and realities. Women, although excluded from formal spaces of teaching and community leadership, exerted a silent influence within the home and in family spiritual life. Mary, from her youth, internalized this double reality, an official one, dominated by social expectations, and another more intimate one, in which her inner world was enriched with questions, intuitions, and glimpses of a different life. The strict separation of genders and roles imposed by the society of her time failed to contain her thirst for knowledge, or her intuition that something existed beyond the visible structures. Despite formal limitations, Mary developed a deep spiritual understanding based on observation, lived experience, and silent reflection. Her immediate environment, the family structure, the cultural tensions of Magdala, the magnificence of the Temple of Jerusalem, and personal experiences of inner conflict shaped a unique personality in her. Mary was not a conformist figure within her community. Her mind and spirit already showed signs of a different future, far removed from the traditional expectations for women of her time. Thus were forged the foundations of the transformation that would mark her life and her place in history. A young woman immersed in her culture, but already distinct in her perception of the world and in her openness to spiritual dimensions that escaped the rigid categories of her era. The spiritual awakening, visions and first callings. During her adolescence, Mary of Magdala began to have spiritual experiences that did not fit within the traditional framework in which she had been educated. Although religiosity was part of daily life in Magdala, individual manifestations were not encouraged. It was believed that God no longer communicated directly with people, but only through the scriptures and established rites. Mary began to perceive sensations that escaped common practices. During moments of recollection, she felt the presence of something she could not name, but which she experienced as real. Initially isolated, these episodes repeated with increasing frequency. One afternoon, secluded in an olive grove, she had a luminous experience accompanied by a voice urging her not to fear and to prepare for something she did not yet understand. Aware of social restrictions, she chose to remain silent. The internal tension was evident. On the one hand, she had to respect the teachings of her family and religious leaders. On the other, her experiences suggested that there was a deeper spiritual dimension that formal doctrine did not address. Without access to advanced religious studies, her education was limited to oral tradition and domestic practice, forcing her to rely on her capacity for discernment. Over time, Mary developed a different perception of her surroundings. Small events, changes in nature, or casually heard words acquired a special meaning for her. This sensitivity offered her a different path of understanding, based on observation and intuition. The memory of the Temple of Jerusalem, visited in her childhood, now acquired another nuance. She remembered the solemnity of the place, but sensed that the sacred was not limited to a physical space. This perception broadened her spiritual vision, distancing her from a purely ritualistic understanding of faith. At night, she contemplated the starry sky, formulating questions about her existence and her relationship with the divine. The idea of following the traditional path reserved for women of her time became increasingly alien. Although she did not know the direction her life would take, she felt that it would not conform to usual expectations. The fear of misunderstanding was present. She knew that her community would not easily accept unusual manifestations, especially coming from a woman. Therefore, she cultivated discretion, protecting her experiences from the gaze of others. Each new episode strengthened her conviction of receiving a special calling. Without tangible proof or visible teachers, she moved forward trusting an inner perception that challenged the conventions of her environment. Through constant observation and silent reflection, Mary shaped an understanding of the world based on direct experience. While externally she continued to participate in the daily life of Magdala, internally a deeper perception of the sacred was consolidating. In this stage of her life, Mary of Magdala maintained her social and family environment, without visible alterations. The spiritual experiences she was beginning to live remained guarded in her privacy, while in the public sphere she continued to meet the expectations assigned to her condition. The hidden bond with Jesus, beyond the disciple. Mary of Magdala's life took a decisive turn when she met Jesus of Nazareth. The canonical Gospels mention her as a witness to essential events, and various complementary sources reinforce the idea of a special bond that placed her in a relevant position within the circle of followers. Mary joined the movement at a stage when Jesus' teachings were beginning to spread through the regions of Galilee and Judea. According to the accounts, she was freed from a state of spiritual suffering, after which she decided to accompany him along with other disciples. Her name appears frequently in the texts, often before those of male figures, suggesting a prominent recognition of her importance. The Gospel of Philip, part of early Christian literature, presents Mary as a trusted person close to Jesus. It describes a relationship based on deep understanding, in which she received reserved teachings, not always shared with the rest of the disciples. This situation caused tensions, especially among some of the more prominent followers. The community forming around Jesus was diverse. It included fishermen, tax collectors, women from different backgrounds, and people seeking spiritual renewal. The active participation of women like Mary represented a break from traditional norms, which assigned a limited role to the female gender within religious life. The Gospel of Mary confirms her relevant position. In this text, after Jesus' departure, Mary transmits teachings to the disciples and faces the distrust of figures like Peter. These scenes show that her role was not limited to assistance, but included the interpretation and transmission of fundamental doctrines. Her status as the first witness to the resurrection, recognized in the 4 canonical Gospels, reinforces her centrality in decisive moments of the movement. In a context where a woman's testimony had little legal validity, the choice of Mary as the primary messenger highlights the uniqueness of her relationship with Jesus. Some sources use terms that allow interpreting their bond as a connection of intimate knowledge, focused on spiritual understanding rather than a relationship of another kind. This approach is consistent with Gnostic currents, which privileged inner experience over ritualistic adherence. In a society that restricted women's functions to the private sphere, Mary's presence among the active disciples constituted an anomaly. Her access to certain levels of teaching and her direct participation in the life of the group challenged the dominant social and religious structures. The testimonies mentioning Mary at key moments of the Christian movement suggest that her influence was real and recognized. The repeated mention of her name in prominent places in the narratives reinforces the impression that her role was neither circumstantial nor marginal. Over time, as the structures of the Church consolidated, female participation in the early Christian circles was progressively minimized. Nevertheless, sources preserving alternative traditions keep alive the image of Mary as an active figure in the transmission of the original message. After Jesus' death, the communities faced internal tensions over the interpretation of his teachings and the definition of authority. In this scenario, figures like Mary of Magdala represented a current that valued direct spiritual experience, in contrast to the hierarchical structures that were beginning to be established. In the complex environment of nascent Christianity, Mary of Magdala appears as a singular disciple, linked to the essence of Jesus' teachings. Her presence among the followers reflects a model of spiritual leadership that, although later relegated, formed an integral part of the first expressions of the Christian faith. The Silent Gospels, Mary in the Apocryphal Texts. Various writings that emerged in the first centuries of Christianity offer complementary perspectives on the role of Mary of Magdala. These texts, considered apocryphal by the official tradition, allow for the reconstruction of aspects of her life and mission that the canonical sources do not detail explicitly. The Gospel of Mary presents Mary as a figure of spiritual authority within the group of disciples. After Jesus' departure, while some followers experienced fear and disorientation, Mary assumed the responsibility of transmitting teachings received in private. In the accounts, she faces opposition from some disciples, particularly Peter, who questions the authenticity of her knowledge. Mary responds firmly, defending the legitimacy of the revelation she had received. The Gospel of Philip introduces another dimension to the relationship between Jesus and Mary. In this text, she is presented as someone who maintained a special connection with the Master, characterized by the direct transmission of profound teachings. The work highlights the importance of gnosis, or spiritual knowledge, and suggests that Mary had accessed levels of understanding not reached by all the disciples. In the Gospel of Thomas, although Mary does not occupy a principal role, a vision of discipleship is evident where access to wisdom did not depend on gender. The teachings contained in this text prioritize inner experience as the path to knowledge, opening a space where figures like Mary could play a relevant role. The documents found in Nag Hammadi reinforce this image. In various Gnostic works, Mary of Magdala is portrayed as a privileged interpreter of Jesus' secret teachings. The direct experience of the divine without institutional intermediaries is valued as the most authentic form of knowledge, and Mary appears as a model of this privileged access. These texts reflect a context in which the active participation of women in the early Christian communities was not unusual. Mary's presence in roles of spiritual leadership suggests that the first expressions of Christianity allowed for a diversity of voices that, over time, was restricted as ecclesiastical structures consolidated. The differences among the apocryphal Gospels do not eliminate the common pattern. Mary of Magdala as a recipient and transmitter of special knowledge. Her figure is associated with a deep understanding of Jesus' teachings, and her ability to guide other disciples is highlighted in several accounts. Over the centuries, Christian communities began to define an official canon of scriptures. In this process, many works that proposed alternative visions, including the Gospels that granted a relevant role to female figures, were excluded. The consolidation of a male hierarchical structure in the Church progressively reduced the recognition of spiritual models, like the one Mary represented. The modern recovery of the Nag Hammadi texts allowed for the rediscovery of these perspectives. Although not all writings agree on their assessment of Mary, the body of apocryphal testimonies places her in a position of considerable spiritual importance within circles that sought to preserve teachings considered esoteric or reserved. In Gnostic works, Mary of Magdala symbolizes the possibility of inner knowledge accessible to those who seek sincerely, without the need for intermediaries. Her figure is associated with wisdom that arises from direct experience, in contrast to the emphasis on external norms and hierarchies that would characterize the official tradition. The exclusion of these texts did not completely eliminate the memory of this alternative model. Traces of Mary's importance persist in fragmentary testimonies and references that survive in the narratives admitted within the canon. Through the silenced Gospels, one accesses an image of Mary of Magdala different from the one that prevailed in later tradition. She is not just a faithful disciple or a privileged witness, but a figure who embodied a spiritual path centered on the personal experience of the truth transmitted by Jesus. The apostolic dispute, confrontations with Peter and the disciples. Mary of Magdala's active participation in the circle of disciples generated tensions reflected in several texts of early Christian literature. These sources present differences of opinion among Jesus' followers regarding spiritual authority and the legitimacy of certain testimonies. The Gospel of Mary offers one of the clearest testimonies of this dispute. After Jesus' departure, the disciples, immersed in fear, seek guidance. Mary intervenes to transmit teachings received directly from the Master. Peter reacts by questioning her authority, expressing doubts about the possibility that a woman could have received hidden revelations not entrusted to the men of the group. This scene suggests an internal struggle for the interpretive legitimacy of Jesus' message. While some, like Levi, defend Mary's position, others manifest resistance to accepting her leadership role. The episode reflects an underlying conflict between an open conception of spiritual transmission and a more hierarchical and exclusive vision. The Gospel of Thomas, although not directly mentioning the conflict between Mary and Peter, contains passages where women's access to spiritual knowledge is discussed. In one of the sayings attributed to Jesus, allusion is made to the transformation necessary for women to enter the kingdom, which has been interpreted as an echo of the existing tensions in the early community regarding the place of women. These accounts reveal that the movement initiated by Jesus was not exempt from internal debates. The diversity of the followers' origins, their different understandings of the message, and the social expectations of the era contributed to a climate of discussion about leadership and the interpretation of the teachings. The figure of Peter represents, in these narratives, a tendency toward structuring the community according to traditional patterns of authority. Resistance to accepting Mary's leadership can be understood in this context as a manifestation of the tensions between different visions of the path the group should follow after Jesus' departure. Mary of Magdala's participation as a transmitter of teachings is not presented in the apocryphal texts as an anecdotal fact, but as a recognized and at the same time conflictive function. Her role is framed within a tradition that valued direct experience and inner wisdom, in contrast to emerging models more oriented towards formal hierarchy. The insistence on highlighting Peter's doubts towards Mary suggests that the conflict was not merely personal, but involved a dispute over the source and validity of spiritual authority. Accepting Mary's leadership implied recognizing a path of access to truth different from the structured authority that was beginning to consolidate in the early communities. In the subsequent evolution of Christianity, the trend towards institutionalization and the exclusion of women from positions of teaching and direction became more pronounced. The accounts presenting Mary as a bearer of teachings received directly from Jesus were marginalized in favor of an official narrative where male leadership was consolidated as the norm. The dispute between Mary and Peter, reflected in the early texts, illustrates one of the internal dynamics of nascent Christianity. Not only was the interpretation of the teachings debated, but also the very nature of authority within the community of believers. This confrontation was not openly resolved in the canonical texts, but its presence in the apocryphal Gospels reveals the existence of an intense debate that marked the first decades of the movement. Mary of Magdala, as a figure of spiritual wisdom, represented a tradition that valued inner knowledge and direct experience against models that privileged organization and doctrinal control. In this context, her figure appears as testimony to an initial diversity that, over time, would be reduced in favor of more rigid structures. The apostolic dispute, as presented in the apocryphal accounts, is a window into that foundational stage, where definitions regarding leadership, teaching, and authority were still in the process of configuration. Gregory's error, the birth of the sinner myth. In the 6th century, the public perception of Mary of Magdala underwent a profound change. This process originated in the preaching of Pope Gregory I, also known as Gregory the Great, who formulated an interpretation that, over time, would transform Mary's image within Western Christianity. In a series of homilies delivered in Rome, Gregory proposed the identification of 3 women mentioned in the Gospels: Mary of Magdala, the anonymous sinner who anoints Jesus' feet in the Gospel of Luke, and Mary of Bethany, sister of Lazarus. According to his interpretation, these 3 figures corresponded to the same person, despite the Gospel accounts presenting them as distinct. This fusion of identities lacked a solid foundation in the original texts. However, it responded to a theological logic that sought to illustrate divine mercy through the conversion of a repentant sinner. Mary of Magdala was, from then on, associated in official teaching with the figure of a redeemed, sinful woman, displacing references to her role as the principal witness of the resurrection. Gregory's discourse had a considerable impact on medieval Christian culture. From this moment on, the representation of Mary in art, literature, and popular preaching focused on her supposed sinful past and her exemplary conversion. Her figure was used as a model of penance, emphasizing the need for repentance and humility, virtues especially demanded of women in the social context of the time. This new focus on Mary reinforced a gender pattern that assigned women a subordinate role within religious life. The transformation of a prominent disciple into a symbol of repentance responded both to theological needs and social interests, in a period when the ecclesiastical structure sought to consolidate its moral and doctrinal authority. During the subsequent centuries, the image of Mary as a repentant sinner spread widely. Iconographically, she was represented with symbols associated with sin and penance, such as the perfume jar, loose hair, and intensely colored clothing. These representations reinforced the narrative established by Gregory, eclipsing her original role in the Gospel accounts and in the oldest traditions. Gregory's teaching remained in effect without significant questioning until the modern era. The recovery of other testimonies about Mary of Magdala, as well as a more rigorous analysis of the biblical texts, allowed for the realization that the identification between the 3 women was not supported by the Gospel accounts. Nevertheless, the cultural association was already firmly established. This process of transforming the figure of Mary of Magdala had lasting consequences on collective perception. Through the centuries, the image of the great penitent predominated over any other interpretation, influencing both religious thought and cultural manifestations. The erroneous identification not only altered the perception of Mary, but also reflected the era's tendency to configure female models around the need for redemption and obedience. In this scheme, the possibility of recognizing a woman as a spiritual leader and legitimate transmitter of teachings was displaced. The representation of Mary of Magdala as a sinner also allowed for underscoring the transformative capacity of divine grace, a central theme in medieval preaching. However, this formulation concealed her status as a close disciple of Jesus and her active participation in the early moments of Christianity. With the advancement of biblical studies and interest in early Christian traditions, the historical figure of Mary of Magdala began to be re-evaluated. The analysis of the Gospels and other documents made it possible to distinguish between the different women mentioned in the accounts and to recover Mary's original profile as a witness to the resurrection and a recognized disciple. Thus, Gregory's era solidified as a key event in the transformation of the memory of Mary of Magdala. The interpretation proposed in the 6th century shaped the popular image of one of the most relevant figures of early Christianity for centuries, profoundly modifying her legacy in the Western tradition. The erased footprints, Mary in medieval ecclesiastical censorship. After the consolidation of Christianity as the dominant religion in the West, the figure of Mary of Magdala underwent a process of transformation and reduction that affected her presence in official accounts. During the Middle Ages, references to her role as a close disciple of Jesus became increasingly marginal, while her identification as a repentant sinner acquired a preeminent place in preaching, art, and literature. The institutionalization of the Church required clear models of authority and conduct. In this context, the representation of Mary as a penitent was functional to the structure being configured. The emphasis on her supposed past of sin, followed by conversion, reinforced discourses on the need for obedience, humility, and repentance, especially directed towards women. The reduction of her image also involved the progressive omission of elements that showed her as a spiritual leader and transmitter of teachings. Texts mentioning Mary as a repository of revelations or suggesting her intellectual and spiritual closeness to Jesus were set aside in favor of narratives more consistent with the model of penitent virtue. The censorship process did not consist of the explicit elimination of the canonical Gospels, where Mary still appears as a witness to the resurrection, but in the systematic reinterpretation of her figure through homilies, theological commentaries, and artistic representations. Her prominence in the foundational moments was minimized, and her role was redirected towards a model acceptable within medieval social and ecclesiastical norms. This transformation was reflected in iconography. Mary of Magdala came to be represented mainly in scenes of repentance, with attributes emphasizing her status as a redeemed sinner. The symbolism associated with her image, such as the perfume jar and loose hair, reinforced the narrative constructed from Gregory the Great's homily. In the theological sphere, medieval treatises consolidated this image, relying on the authority of church fathers and allegorical interpretations of biblical texts. The possibility of considering Mary as a leader or spiritual teacher was relegated to marginal interpretations, with no space in the official discourse. The transmission of this new image was reinforced by popular literature, which collected and amplified representations of Mary as an example of conversion. Through sermons, plays, and hagiographic accounts, a version of her story was consolidated that maintained her presence in the collective memory, but profoundly modified from its origins. The development of this narrative was also conditioned by the internal tensions of the Church regarding the participation of women in public and spiritual life. As female religious orders grew in number and influence, it became necessary to promote models of sanctity appropriate to expectations of obedience and modesty. Mary of Magdala, presented as an exemplary penitent, offered a convenient archetype to guide female spirituality. The censorship of her figure was not a single act, but a gradual process of reinterpretation that extended over centuries. This adaptation strategy allowed her memory to be maintained within Christianity, but in a controlled form consistent with the interests of the ecclesiastical hierarchy. During the late Middle Ages, some heterodox movements attempted to recover a different vision of Mary, recognizing her as a symbol of spiritual wisdom. However, these efforts failed to consolidate against the weight of the official tradition, which continued to promote the image of the repentant sinner. The censorship process also affected the perception of other female figures in early Christianity. The tendency to subordinate women's spiritual activity to models of penance and humility spread widely, shaping an imaginary where holy women were above all examples of conversion and submission rather than leadership and teaching. Through this process, the original image of Mary of Magdala as a prominent disciple, transmitter of teachings, and witness of foundational events was displaced towards a more limited representation. Her legacy was preserved partially, conditioned by the ideological and social needs of each era. Thus, during the Middle Ages, the footprints of Mary of Magdala's true identity were progressively erased or transformed, remaining subordinate to a narrative that prioritized penance over leadership, humility over wisdom, and obedience over spiritual initiative. Modern rehabilitation, rediscovery of Mary Magdalene. Beginning in the 19th century, advances in biblical and archaeological studies prompted a revision of many historical figures of Christianity, including Mary of Magdala. The development of critical methods applied to the analysis of sacred texts allowed for the re-examination of traditional accounts and the distinction between theological, cultural, and literary elements. Researchers from various currents began to point out that the identification between Mary of Magdala, the anonymous sinner, and Mary of Bethany, established by Gregory the Great, lacked clear support in the Gospels. Detailed study of the canonical texts showed that Mary of Magdala consistently appeared as a distinct figure, especially linked to the events of the resurrection. The recovery of the Nag Hammadi manuscripts in 1945, which included the Gospel of Mary and other Gnostic texts, offered new perspectives on her role in the early Christian communities. These documents presented Mary as a bearer of profound teachings and a spiritual leader, contrasting with the image disseminated during the Middle Ages. The growing academic attention towards the diversity of early Christianities opened a space for reconsidering the figure of Mary of Magdala. Specialized authors began to highlight her relevance as a privileged witness of fundamental events and as an active disciple, distancing her from the exclusive representation as a symbol of penance. In the theological field, some sectors promoted a revision of the liturgy and festivities related to Mary of Magdala. In 2016, the Catholic Church elevated the liturgical memorial of Mary Magdalene to the rank of feast, equating her celebration to that of the Apostles. This decision reflected a formal recognition of her central role in the resurrection accounts. The rediscovery of Mary of Magdala not only affected academic research and liturgical practice, but also contemporary art and literature. Novels, historical studies, essays, and audiovisual productions explored previously marginalized aspects of her life, contributing to broadening her representation beyond the stereotype of the repentant sinner. In the field of gender studies, Mary of Magdala gained relevance as a symbol of historical tensions surrounding women's participation in spaces of religious authority. The critical review of her figure also allowed for reflection on the processes by which social and ecclesiastical structures shaped collective memory. The modern recovery of Mary of Magdala does not imply idealization, but an effort to place her in her historical context, recognizing her function as an active disciple and her role in the transmission of fundamental teachings. The variety of available sources, both canonical and apocryphal, allows for the construction of a more nuanced image of her life and legacy. The rehabilitation process has not completely eliminated traditional representations, which remain present in broad sectors of popular and religious culture. However, the dissemination of serious research has allowed for the opening of spaces for critical reflection and revaluation of her figure. Through interdisciplinary studies combining history, archaeology, philology, and theology, Mary of Magdala has been relocated on the map of early Christianity as one of the most relevant figures. This relocation does not intend to replace one myth with another, but to offer a more balanced vision based on the analysis of available sources. The recovery of her original profile has also fostered interest in other female figures in Christian history, contributing to a broader effort to recognize women in the foundational processes of the faith. Thus, the modern rediscovery of Mary of Magdala is part of a more general dynamic of critical revision of religious history, aimed at understanding the complexities of early Christianity with greater rigor and recognizing the voices that, for centuries, were relegated in the official narrative. The flight to France. Legends about the hidden destiny of Mary Magdalene. During the Middle Ages, various traditions emerged in Europe, attributing to Mary of Magdala a trajectory subsequent to the events narrated in the Gospels. One of the most widespread holds that, after the death of Jesus and the initial persecutions against his followers, Mary would have left Palestine and traveled to the south of present-day France. According to these traditions, Mary of Magdala would have embarked on the coasts of Judea along with other disciples, among them Lazarus, Martha, and Maximinus. After a perilous journey, they landed in a region known as Provence. This account appears in medieval hagiographic literature, especially in the Book of James, and in other later texts that consolidated devotion around her figure in this area. In Provence, Mary would have begun a work of evangelization, spreading Jesus' teachings among the local populations. According to these legends, her preaching extended to several communities, where she would have succeeded in converting numerous inhabitants to nascent Christianity. Subsequently, seeking a life of spiritual retreat, Mary would have settled in a cave in the Massif of the Sainte-Baume, a mountainous and isolated place. There she would have led an existence of penance and contemplation until her death. The Sainte-Baume cave transformed into an important pilgrimage center during the Middle Ages, and the veneration of Mary in this region was consolidated with the construction of sanctuaries and monasteries dedicated to her memory. The account of her stay in France was actively promoted by the local church, especially in the context of the expansion of pilgrimage routes in Europe. The figure of Mary of Magdala became an emblem of the transmission of early Christianity to the West, reinforcing the religious identity of Provence and its symbolic connection with the origins of the faith. The presence of relics attributed to Mary of Magdala in various French temples, such as the Basilica of Saint-Maximin-la-Sainte-Baume, strengthened these traditions. The preservation and veneration of these relics responded both to popular devotion and to ecclesiastical and political interests, seeking to consolidate the spiritual importance of the region. These medieval traditions are not based on contemporary testimonies to the events, but rather form part of a hagiographic construction elaborated centuries later. However, they reflect the need of medieval Christian communities to establish direct links with the foundational times of Christianity. The image of Mary of Magdala as a preacher in distant lands and as an example of penitent life contributed to consolidating her figure within the religious culture of Western Europe. The combination of elements of evangelization and ascetic retreat responded to the ideals of sanctity promoted at the time. In the medieval context, these narratives also served to reinforce the role of women in the expansion of the faith, albeit framing them within models of humility and sacrifice. Mary's life in the solitude of the Sainte-Baume was presented as an example of Christian virtue, accessible and admirable for the faithful. The dissemination of these legends influenced not only popular religiosity, but also the artistic, literary, and architectural production of the region. Frescoes, sculptures, and manuscripts illustrated episodes of her preaching and retreat, strengthening the memory of her presence in Provence. Although the accounts of Mary's flight to France are not found in early Christian sources, their rootedness in medieval culture evidences the impact of her figure on the collective imagination. The persistence of these accounts over the centuries reflects the symbolic importance her legacy acquired in geographical and social contexts different from those of her original life. The tradition of Mary of Magdala in Provence continues to be alive today, through pilgrimages, religious festivities, and cultural activities that maintain the memory of this version of her story. Regardless of their historical basis, these traditions have contributed to shaping an additional dimension of her legacy in the Christian imaginary. Thus, the account of the flight to France represents another chapter in the complex construction of the memory of Mary of Magdala, where elements of devotion, regional identity, and spiritual aspirations converge, which, throughout the centuries, have kept her presence current in the history of the Christian faith. The legacy of Mary Magdalene in contemporary culture. The figure of Mary of Magdala has experienced a notable presence in contemporary cultural expressions, both in the academic and artistic spheres. Her image, previously limited to certain stereotypes, has been the subject of a process of rereading that has diversified interpretations of her life and historical significance. In modern literature, Mary of Magdala has been presented in multiple ways. Works of fiction and historical essays have explored her role as a disciple, spiritual leader, and symbol of feminine wisdom in early Christianity. These representations have sought to be based on documented research, avoiding the reproduction of traditional patterns that identified her solely as a repentant sinner. Cinema and television have also contributed to this process of revaluation. Recent productions have shown Mary of Magdala as a close follower of Jesus, focusing her characterization on her spiritual commitment and active participation within the group of disciples. Although interpretations vary, the general trend has been to offer an image more faithful to the available historical data. In the fields of music, theatre, and visual arts, her figure has served as inspiration for exploring themes such as faith, redemption, spirituality, and female leadership. Artists from different traditions have turned to her story to represent processes of personal transformation, inner search, and renewal. The influence of Mary of Magdala also extends to contemporary social and religious movements, seeking to recover female voices within spiritual traditions. In some circles, her figure has become an emblem for advocating the active participation of women in faith communities. From an academic perspective, her study has fostered debates on the construction of historical memory, the transmission of religious traditions, and the role of women in the origins of Christianity. Interdisciplinary research has allowed for a better understanding of how her image was shaped over the centuries and how those transformations reflected power dynamics within the Church. Interest in Mary of Magdala has also stimulated the review of other ancient texts, both canonical and apocryphal, in search of a broader understanding of the environment in which the Jesus movement arose. Her figure has served as a starting point for examining the diversity of roles and perspectives present in early Christianity. At a symbolic level, Mary of Magdala today represents for many the possibility of a spirituality based on direct experience, personal search, and faithful testimony, without the need for institutional intermediaries. This interpretation, although not universal, has found resonance in communities that value an experience of faith centered on interiority and authenticity. The recovery of her original image has not been without controversy. The reinterpretation of her figure has sparked debates both inside and outside religious spheres, reflecting the persistent relevance of issues of gender, authority, and memory in contemporary societies. In recent historical studies, Mary of Magdala occupies a place of growing importance as a fundamental witness to the resurrection and as an active figure in the configuration of the first Christian communities. Her legacy, reconstructed from ancient accounts and modern findings, offers a richer and more complex perspective on the origins of the Christian faith. The contemporary representation of Mary of Magdala does not aim to fix a definitive image, but to open a space for reflection on her historical and spiritual significance. Her life, as it can be reconstructed, invites consideration of the plurality of experiences and voices that shaped Christianity in its beginnings. Thus, in contemporary culture, Mary of Magdala remains a living figure, capable of inspiring new interpretations, prompting rigorous research, and offering a significant reference in the dialogue about memory, faith, and the role of women in religious traditions. Mary of Magdala occupies a unique place in the history of early Christianity. From her origins in Galilee, her life was marked by a spiritual awakening that led her to integrate into the close circle of Jesus of Nazareth. Her active participation, her privileged access to teachings, and her status as the principal witness of the resurrection placed her in a relevant role within the nascent movement. Throughout the centuries, her figure underwent substantial transformations. The identification proposed in the 6th century between Mary of Magdala, the anonymous sinner, and Mary of Bethany profoundly altered collective perception, relegating her role as disciple and transmitter of teachings to a model of penance. This change was consolidated through preaching, art, and medieval literature, where her image became subordinate to ideals of repentance and obedience. The apocryphal texts preserve testimonies of a different tradition, in which Mary appears as an interpreter of profound revelations and as a leader within the group of disciples. The dispute reflected in these writings between Mary and figures like Peter illustrates the internal tensions over leadership and the transmission of doctrine in the early Christian communities. The expansion of medieval traditions placing her in Provence, in the south of France, added new dimensions to her legacy. According to these accounts, Mary would have continued her evangelizing work in the West, establishing a symbolic link between the roots of Christianity and the spiritual identity of medieval Europe. The process of modern rehabilitation, driven by advances in biblical and archaeological studies, allowed for a critical review of inherited interpretations. This rereading repositioned Mary of Magdala in her original context as an active disciple and fundamental figure in the earliest testimonies of the Christian faith. In contemporary culture, her legacy has acquired new projections, inspiring literary, artistic, and academic representations that highlight her role in religious history and her contribution to the understanding of the origins of Christianity. Through these multiple reconstructions, Mary of Magdala remains a testament to the complexity of historical memory and the evolution of spiritual traditions over time.